when you're talking about defense cooperation across the Atlantic, I think you're trying to achieve 4 objectives, and they're pretty straightforward. One is you're trying to increase capacity. You want more military formations, more mass, to be able to deal with threats, not just Russia, but out-of-area threats as well. You're also trying to, secondly, increase capability. You want the best technology for our forces, and the best way to get to source technology is going to be international. Use our allies. The U.S. has great technology, but not all of it. And I think so that cooperation can lead to capability. The third, and I think it's really been risen to the top now with Ukraine, is you want depth. You need to be able to have the munitions, precision guided or otherwise. You need to be able to replace equipment. So you're looking for a depth in that industrial base that again you can look to that cross-Atlantic cooperation. And then finally, you're looking for cost efficiency. How do you do things at a scale that's going to bring the costs down? There's, I think, only really 2 paths to get those 4 things. One is specialization. You can decide one country is going to build infantry fighting vehicles, a different one is going to do munitions, a different one still is going to do aircraft, or you can share it across a couple, but you don't really want 32 different aircraft, you don't want 32 different infantry fighting vehicles, and we're closer to that than we'd like to be. It's not 32, but there's a lot. And so the specialization is I think the most difficult politically because it's the most obvious way to efficiency in particular, but the political directives for both jobs and having the technology within your own base, the engineering base. All countries want some portion of that, so that's a significant barrier to specialization. The easier path, the other path, is collaboration. You're seeing it now. There's 2 European fighters being developed, and one of them is European-Japanese. But we've collaborated on the F-35. We've had different places where you at least move the production to different countries. But I think that it's how do we leverage those 2 paths, collaboration and specialization, to achieve the 4 goals of capability, capacity, depth, and efficiency. And I think everything else is just moving things around. There are barriers to achieving it. There are ways to overcome the barriers, but you can't ignore them.
One thing I would also add:
multi-year funding. You have to be able to predict the amount of money. As a former comptroller, if the budget goes down significantly in a year or over a couple of years, always the easiest thing to change is the production rate. You can't change the force structure overnight. You're not going to pay the troops less. You don't want readiness to go down. What can you do? You can buy fewer end items. There's an inefficiency in that, but otherwise it's very doable. And so if you put multi-years in place, you take away that flexibility. I think that's what Ellen's saying. So what you have to have is a world where you're not going to need that flexibility, where you're going to have a predictable budget to within at least some parameters. If you don't have that, it makes multi-years much harder. It's one way. I think I think what you're really highlighting is I think we underappreciated the value of munition stocks. And so people thought this was a lower priority. When you're cutting the budget, you cut lower priority. I think it's really a realignment of the priorities. There is a cost to this. You're going to have to give, top line probably isn't going up because of this. No. So you're going to have to give something else up, and you're going to have to put that surge capacity higher on your list than it has been in the past. I think that's one of the major impacts of Ukraine, is that we realized that we underappreciated the value of the stocks, of the surge capacity, and it isn't, well, nobody thought it was a free move, but people thought it was a lower priority item.
Well, for a while, we were, thinking it was all from the sky or from the sea, right? And so munitions were a bit devalued. So I'd say another lens we need to have here as we think about future planning and programming and budgeting is that a lot of our major weapon systems are beginning to be bifurcated into hardware and software. And the hardware, a ship, an aircraft, and so forth, is becoming a little bit more the commodity, and it's the software that's being upgraded on a routine basis. So these systems are hardware enabled, but they're software defined. And perhaps we need to think a little bit more about munitions and guided weapons, where frankly, there's a lot of metal and so forth that goes in those that you can't get around it. So how can we sort of rethink our capability, if you will, through software and hardware?
We've been heavily influenced by a couple of paradigms that are changing. One is, remember Desert Storm, was it 96 hours? And so we thought we just needed enough to take somebody down in 96 hours, which worked fine for that particular scenario. And then for the next 20 years, really, the scenario has been dominated by counterinsurgency, which requires a lot, but it's a different kind of requirement. It's very different than what we're seeing in Ukraine, with a large-scale ground warfare over a longer period of time. And then we're kind of imagining in the Pacific, not quite the same fight, but the same kind of duration anyway. And that's changing your requirements from what we were thinking about from, kind of 90 to 2011, 2015. And we have to shift our industrial thinking as well as our strategic thinking to back that up. Well, as always, what you want in industry is predictability. So you're looking for the government to figure out what it wants and tell you. I think with interchangeability, we haven't quite gotten there yet. I think it's a little bit more aspirational than it is concrete. I think it's the right way to go, and I understand the logic of it. But I think what we need to do then is to say, okay, concretely, what does that mean for the equipment that we want to buy? Where do we want industry to make investments? Where can we get, frankly, cross-border collaboration, or maybe you're making the same thing or compatible things on both sides of the Atlantic. But it's going to take some sort of government policy set. The industry is not going to be able to create this for the government. They're going to be able to respond to the government, but only if it's laid out in some multi-year fashion. It happens in Ukraine, because the circumstances is really fighting alone, but that's not necessarily always going to be the case. And you're going to want to be able, so it's not just munitions, it's communications, it's command and control. It's how do we have that interchangeability across the functions of the force, not just, munitions is particularly important right now with Ukraine, but it's not the only game.
I'm totally with you on that.
That right now in the submarine industrial base, with the recent AUKUS agreement. Right now, our submarine industrial base cannot quite produce 3 submarines a year. We want to produce 2 Virginia and 1 Columbia. We're a little short of that, and so the Virginia's go a little slower than we'd like. The aspiration is to increase that submarine industrial base, and with AUKUS adding a submarine in about 2030, we're going to have to. The way to do that is to push. We're not going to build another nuclear submarine yard. So we're going to have to get more capacity out of that yard, which means you're going to have to push work to suppliers. But if you do that, you can focus then the workforce at the yards to increasing the throughput. And that's indeed what the Navy and the yards are looking at right now, well in advance of that AUKUS requirement. So I think that's a place where if you have the desire and the need, you can drive an industrial capacity to the levels that we need to support the national strategy.
It's a really good point, because Pillar 2 of AUKUS is going to be broader and has lots of applicability as well. And I think for the first time we have incredible policy top cover with AUKUS and then INTIB below it.
Which talked about it. I think the most important thing for industry is predictability. I think it's the bargain that you make in the defense industrial base is the government pays a substantial part, but not all of your development costs. The straining margins is the trade-off. but you have to know where you're investing, because these are long-term investments. So if the goal shifts year to year, or every couple of years, or even administration to administration, it's very, very difficult to make the kind of longer-term capacity and facility investments that are needed to deliver what the government wants. So the more predictability, the more assurance you can have that the investments you make are truly where the government is trying to take the security environment, that's, I think, is going to get you both the best technological answer and the most cost-efficient answer.
So predictability.